The beginning. Joe started his day like many others in the forest when he woke up with the feeling of sunshine on his face. The warmth that the sun gave off always made his whiskers stand up. He was never a morning person and would be delighted just to sleep until the sun was high in the sky, but he knew he would never get away with that. Joe's parents would make him and his sister get up to explore and learn to be part of the pack. After a few minutes, Joe's eyes widened to see the landscape surrounding them. They had chosen this perch high up on a hill to spend the night. The pack could see all around, but the grass hid them from any predators searching for them at night. Suddenly, he felt a thump on his side and let out a slight groan. It was his sister Katie jumping on him since she was wide awake. Katie always wanted to play. Joe got up and ran after her. Their mother stood above them, watching the surrounding terrain. Joe took a quick look around. He could see the other pack members standing around, getting ready for the day ahead. Katie bumped into him as his attention was diverted from her for a moment, and he chased after her as she laughed. He finally caught her, which wasn't hard, but he wanted to allow her to feel like she could be faster than him. He pounced, and she let out a loud yell. At that moment, Joe's mom said, "Joe, be careful with your sister, remember she is still growing." "Yes, Mom," Joe replied. Even though he thought he wanted to say, "What about me? I am only a year older and still trying to figure out everything too." Joe was always a curious little guy. He would play in the grass, run through the trees and bump into the trunks when he noticed a butterfly or bird swooping by. Colliding with the giant trees of the forest would always give him a big thump on the head. But he knew that he had to protect his sister, and he would always do that, no matter what. Their mom motioned to them that it was time to get some water and look for food. The pack consisted of 12 wolves, 2 male brothers, 6 females, and 4 children. 2 of the children were Katie's age. They were still learning how to move around by themselves. They spent most of their time with their mothers for safety. The pack seemed to get along well and always protected each other. This particular day, as they were walking down to the watering hole, a large pack of hyenas was approaching on both sides. They are scavengers who usually left the wolves alone, but they saw any children, even wolf cubs, as a quick meal. The 2 brothers, named Caesar and Fred, noticed the hyenas and immediately raised the alarm. A sudden low ruff that the pack all knew and responded to. They created a circle. The younger ones at the center, and the 2 males are on either side with the females beside them. This surprised the hyenas, who realized it was impossible to get to the center. They left, but the wolves stayed in this position for some minutes to ensure no one had a change of heart. They made it to the watering hole, though Joe couldn't shake the fear of the hyenas as they walked. When they got to the watering hole, the 2 brothers began arguing over who should get water first. Caesar proclaimed that only those females that were loyal to him could drink. Fred's would have to wait and keep guard for them. It was a hot day, and everyone was thirsty. But Caesar won the argument. Joe's mom was one of those who had to stand guard, so Joe had to wait with her. This seemed so unfair to him. Why couldn't the little ones just drink? Joe was agitated by this, too young to understand. Patience is not one of those values you gain when you are born. It takes years to build. He said to his mother, "I am thirsty." "We must wait," she instructed. Joe was impatient but listened. He hadn't liked how Caesar was getting more aggressive. He seemed to be pushing around his brother more and more lately. Joe and his family finally got to drink. They had learned to drink as much as possible, since the pack may not get back there for a few days. Once the pack had all drunk their fill, they ventured back into the forest. This was their general routine for the next year that passed. Joe had grown larger and more prominent, and Katie was now strong enough that Joe would have a bruise for a week if she pounced on him. One day the pack was prowling around when Fred spotted a mature deer in the brush. The pack were hungry, so they began to track the deer as they had so many times before with prey. As they were approaching, Fred noticed a newborn deer in the brush. The pack had always been taught to leave a mother and baby alone if this was the case. There were enough other animals to ensure the wolves would have food in the future. But Caesar didn't see it that way. He said, "Let's get them." As soon as Caesar gave chase, Joe's mom and Fred caught up to him. They stood in his way, and Caesar was forced to make a quick stop. Caesar was at least 30 pounds larger than the other two wolves, but that didn't stop them. He said, "What?" Fred replied, "We are protecting them. You know the code." Caesar replied, "Damn the code, I want to hunt." Fred replied, "No, that isn't our way." Before he could even finish, Caesar's eyes became wide and upset. He had an anger in him that was coming out. Caesar pounced on Fred to take a bite of his neck. Without warning, he also kicked Joe's mom up against a tree trunk. Within a minute, Fred was dead. Caesar let go and said, "We are hunters, they are here for us. If anyone disagrees, you can stand up and fight me." Joe walked over to his mom. She was hurt, her leg was bleeding, and walking would be difficult. Joe didn't think about his choice, he had already made it. He launched himself at Caesar. Caesar had difficulty keeping up with Joe as a younger male, but Caesar was wiser. He knew there was strength in Joe, but Joe couldn't outsmart him. Within moments Caesar had him outflanked and was about to take another bite of Joe's neck when an alarm cry came from the pack. There was a grizzly bear out in the woods. They were no friends of wolves, and the wolves would have to move to stay out of sight. Caesar said, "Leave, don't come back, or I will finish what I started. Your sister can stay." Caesar turned and ran into the forest. The females followed. Katie looked at Joe, but one of the other females said, "Come on, dear," and they all disappeared. Joe walked over to where his mother still lay. Joe's mom looked at him with sad eyes and said, "Joe, I know this isn't the type of life you expected, but I know you have a strong heart and desire. You see the world as it is. It is also possible to see the world as it's supposed to be. I had hoped to give you more opportunity, but it's time to be the wolf you were meant to be." Joe said, "Mom, I will not leave you." Joe's mom said, "Joe, it's time. The bear will be here soon, let's not allow him to find both of us." Joe had no way of carrying his mom. He knew he would have to leave her to survive. Tears were running down his whiskers. His mom and the pack were all he knew. What would he do now? The mountain goat. Joe ran through the forest, going in the exact opposite direction of the pack. He knew that if he went the opposite way, the bear would get confused with all the scent, and he might give his mom a fighting chance for survival. Soon he came to a mountain. He looked back at the forest where he had grown up and made his choice, turning toward the mountain. He was a lone wolf now. But the mountain represented a strange new world, one he was unfamiliar with, and he knew that if wanted to survive in this new environment, then he would have to learn how. There must be other animals he could ask. As he went up the mountain, he saw some mountain goats. They jumped easily from peak to peak, and Joe struggled to follow them. His paws weren't designed for this terrain. He was soon tired and thirsty. He called out to the nearest goat, perched on a high ridge. "Excuse me, do you know how to survive in this world?" The goat looked thoughtful. "Drink plenty of fluids," it said. "But where is the water?" Joe replied. "Snow is always good," said the goat, then it jumped off the ridge. The mountain goat felt sorry for the wolf, but he knew better than to allow him to get too close. Surviving on the mountain was a challenge. The goat had learned from his parents and his grandparents, it might be cold on the mountain, but it was safe. Other animals rarely ventured this high. However, like all animals, they needed to drink. His grandparents had taught him, when you are thirsty, just look around. At first he'd thought they were crazy, but they had survived, just like the generations before them, and so he had quickly learned to do as they did. This was the knowledge he had tried to pass on to the wolf. Joe, however, was confused. Drink plenty of fluids? But there was no water. No river or pools like the ones in the forest. How could he drink unless he went back? But he couldn't do that, he wouldn't endanger his family. He walked on around the mountain, trudging through cold snow. It was beautiful and the sun was shining on the frozen landscape. There must be more than just this, but I can't find it, Joe thought to himself. The goat told me to drink plenty of fluids and said that snow was good, but what did he mean? He looked at the snow all around him, it covered the ground in every direction, but how did that help his thirst? The wolf was walking in the middle regions of the mountains. This region is high enough off the ground to keep lots of animals away, but you could find the pocket of warm spots that you need to live. The goat liked this place on the fifth mountain. It was the fifth since it was 5 peaks away from a big lonely evergreen that grew on a steep slope. When you are up here, you have to use any landmarks to keep you focused in the right direction. Most caves were hidden from the sun on the fifth mountain. They were easy to find and always empty. The goat would climb into the cave near the top of the mountain because there was a gentle slope as you approached this cave. It made it easier for scooping up snow in your mouth and walking it into the cave. There was a dip in the floor down the shelter, 1,000 steps inside. It was drastically warmer here than it was by the mouth of the cave. The goat would carry as much snow as his mouth could hold and put it in this dip. He would do this about 10 times, and a puddle of water would form in the dip. This would give him the ability to drink. This was his way of keeping him and his family's thirst quenched. These are the types of tricks we all learn in life that allow us to navigate the unknown successfully. The goat and his family like to find the caves hidden in the mountains where the temperature is warmer and the snow melts quickly. This wolf would need to do the same, thought the goat. Joe was a curious wolf and he wanted to learn the lesson that the goat had just shared. But it seemed like a desert landscape in the mountains. Each valley and hill seemed higher than the rest, but there was a path that animals could track through each. Joe had learned to track at a young age. He could often see the paths through the forest that most couldn't. He knew that the trails were sometimes covered with undergrowth, but finding the paths that someone traveled on before would make navigating the most unforgiving landscape more accessible. He kept going through the pass between 2 towering mountains. When he looked up, he could see nothing but clouds covering their peaks. He wondered what was up there but knew he would be dead if he didn't find a drink soon. Joe looked at the snow, thinking that he would have to figure out a solution. He decided that he would dig through the snow. That must be what the mountain goat was talking about when he said snow. Joe looked around. He saw a bare spot near the side of one of the mountains that looked like he could dig down. Joe started to use his front legs and dig into the snow. His first instinct was to dig a big hole. As Joe began to dig, the snow was soft in the top layer, but the second layer was more difficult. It was packed down, so he focused on digging a small hole to find the ground underneath the snow. He scooped out a piece with one foot then the other. As he continued, he made progress. After about 30 minutes, he could see the bare ground in the hole. He put his head down, but there was no water there. Just ground. Don't get discouraged, Joe said to himself. I can just try again. This little motivation always helped Joe look on the positive side of situations. Joe saw a stick lying on the ground. He picked it up in his teeth and began to dig through another patch. He was looking for some sign of water. There had to be something since the mountain goats were surviving in these cold, windy conditions. He dug for a while, nothing but the snow kept appearing on the end of his stick. He placed the stick down but stuck his nose into the area he had just cleared. There was nothing there in the area. He could see snow all around but nothing that resembled water. He came up with snow on his nose, but that didn't help. Joe shook his head, and the snow fell off onto the ground. Joe thought about the problem with snow and wondered if maybe he was looking at the problem in the wrong way. He kept looking down at the snow, but perhaps he needed to look up? How could he do that when all the snow was below his feet? Joe stood there for a long minute, just looking at the snow. The white snow had expanded as he dug around the different areas. Joe thought about the hole he had dug with his feet and returned to that hole. Could he dig down in another place to create a tunnel? A tunnel could give him the ability to see the snow in a 360-degree view. This viewpoint might give him the power to find a solution. Joe walked around the peak to another peak where some trees were sprouting, and big snowdrifts were connecting the trees. It was like a bridge connecting each snowdrift with a tree as a fence post. Joe positioned himself in the center of two trees and dug horizontally through the mounds. He could make progress more quickly since this snow was fresh and hadn't been packed down as much as the one by the mountain base. Joe was making a cave for himself. He dug for about an hour until he had created a snow cave. Joe climbed into the cave but continued to dig further, so no part of his body was out in the falling snow. By the time he was complete, his whole body was surrounded by snow. Joe looked up at the snow that was now above him. He could see its white crystal shape both above him and on the walls. How could this help him find water? He could now see snow around him in all directions. Seeing things from a different perspective sometimes helps understand the lesson being taught. But, as he sat there in the snow cave, he didn't see anything to help him. He started to shiver in the snow. This wasn't good. He knew that if he got too cold, his body would freeze. He put his head on the ground and put some snow in his mouth. He wasn't sure why snow in his mouth might help, but maybe tasting this stuff would stop his shivering. He lay there getting colder, and then the snow in his mouth disappeared. It went down his throat like water. It wasn't a lot, but he could feel the cold water going down his throat. Joe realized that the snow was something that turned into water. Joe needed to find someplace warm to think about this. He got out of his snow cave with more enthusiasm than he went in. Getting out of the snow cave gave him energy, but he was still shivering. Joe walked further up the mountain and walked around this new area. The trees were surviving. How are they doing that? He thought. Joe looked all around and saw a small cave that he could fit in. Joe squeezed his body into the cave. Once he got past the opening, the cave opened up enough that he could walk. Within about 100 steps, Joe turned a corner and saw a puddle in front of him. He was about to drink when he noticed it was coming from some melting snow. Like a hammer hitting him on the head, he realized what the mountain goat meant. The snow melts into the water. Joe reached down and drank. The water reinvigorated him. Joe was still in shock from his day's events, but now with lots of fluids, he needed to rest. Resting would be challenging. This is the first night he would be alone without the pack. Joe knew it was better to have a higher vantage point at night, and it allowed the pack always to stay safe and keep watch on what was occurring all around. Joe saw a small hill outside the cave. Joe thought about this, but being out in the snow again didn't seem the brightest idea with the freezing temperatures. It was warmer inside than outside. Joe took a risk. He found a part of the cave where he could lay down. Joe put his head down to think about the experience with the snow. It took him being persistent and finding the melting snow in this warm cave. He knew he wouldn't survive if he hadn't continued to try, but those thoughts were lost when he fell asleep. The fox. Victory comes from finding opportunities in problems, Sun Tzu. The sun rose and woke Joe up immediately as light entered the cave. He didn't feel like resting anymore. The early sunrise energized him. During the night he had been able to sleep soundly. There were no animals around in this landscape that bothered him. The sun's warmth also warmed him up. The snow was interesting, but it was cold. Joe got water from it, then continued on his path. Within a short walk, he could see a group of foxes. Foxes were small and able to fit into all types of spaces. This had always impressed Joe, how an animal could be so nimble that he could get out of any sort of trouble. The foxes were wise animals in the forest. They could always find hidden places that would allow them to see things others couldn't discover. He knew there had to be somewhere to stay warm in the mountains, but they were now more like hills. The landscape was still snowy, but it was beginning to change. Joe thought he was getting closer to the forest again, but he wasn't sure. The fox saw the wolf just staring at him from behind a rock. The fox wondered if the wolf was hungry or if something else was going on. This particular wolf didn't seem like all the other wolves he had run into in the past. Most of them were fierce. They would chase as soon as they saw a fox. Not this guy. He was just sitting there and looking at the world. Foxes have always been known for their ability to get out of any situation. They found it helpful to consider all possibilities when dealing with life. Many other animals would just go with the flow. They didn't stop to think of whether there were alternative paths, situations, and ideas that could provide an expanded world for them to live in. The fox wasn't going to let a specific instance dictate all their lives. If they could have a better opportunity to have more shelter, water, and warmth, they would take advantage of it. The fox had learned that by expanding your mind to see these situations, you could actually make a list of 3 different ways a conversation could go, and it would almost always go in one of those ways. The fox had gotten so good at it that he was starting to predict by 40% margin which way a traveler would take the conversation by the way they looked at the fox. The fox remembered meeting a bird one day, and the bird was asking about the direction in which the bird should fly. The fox looked surprised. Hadn't the bird looked around to get an idea of what existed in each direction to make their decision? It seemed the bird hadn't looked around at all. He preferred just to ask and follow whatever the person asked told him. This demonstrated to the fox that this bird was just used to following whatever someone shared with him. The fox was perplexed by this. How could the bird succeed on his journey if they only took the advice from random people? But the bird seemed content with the information, and as long as it was getting to the next destination, that was good with the bird. The fox thought this would be fine for someone with simple goals. But if you are trying to do something complicated or involves many moving parts without a real plan, there is no way to branch out. The fox knew that this happened to lots of young ones. They were told to get on the path and just follow it. They would never actually strike out on their own to see if there were multiple paths to take you in different directions. The fox remembered a time in his life when he was on his own, and he had to choose. Should he take an opportunity to stay with a group of his kind in a safe and secure area, or should he venture out to see the world? The fox looked around him and made his decision. He knew he was an adventurer. He left the group and went out to see the world. Opportunities are one aspect that the fox knew he would need to consider in his life journey. Many, like the bird, follow others without knowing about all the possibilities. This was something that the fox was not interested in. He wanted to research and understand his options before proceeding on his path. The fox decided to look at the available options about places to live. He discovered that there are possibilities to live in deserts, forests, beaches, mountains, and islands. He had never considered living on an island before, but it sounded dynamic and exciting to be surrounded by water that you could drink at any time. The fox knew it was vital for him to understand what was available, which is essential in seeing when an opportunity exists. When you are only looking at a single choice, there isn't a choice, but he never believed that. The fox always felt in every situation there are choices. Often, you are so focused on the work you miss seeing the light that is shining your way. The fox understood that knowing options worked because he always found an opportunity, even in those darkest days. When everything seems grim, the cold sets in, and the fog surrounds you. The only thing you can see is the pause in front of your face. Your internal drive has to push you to move on, no matter how difficult. It's like you are stuck in a trance without knowing the next step. Because you are wondering if the next step is a cliff or a hole that will get you stuck. Even when those failures came to him, the fox knew he had a plan. The plan would encourage his passion for exploring the world, and the impossible was possible. This passion filled his drive each day. He felt all animals should go out and take a chance. It's a risk, and you could get hurt, but if you take the time to consider all the alternatives, you will be a better fox. The fox knew it wasn't always easy, but he would build his legacy by taking the first step. Each year since he made that choice, he hasn't gone back to his old home. His new home has been this area in the mountains/foothills that the wolf had just stepped into. Again, the fox asked himself why the wolf was still sitting there. Joe yelled out to the fox, who looked fearful and ready to bolt. Joe said, "Excuse me, how do you always know how to escape from situations and fit into the craziest of spaces?" The fox replied, "I am always watching for an opportunity to find my way." Joe said, "Is that way always around the next corner?" The fox replied, "Sometimes it is right in front of me, and I haven't seen it yet." Joe had no idea what that answer meant, but before he could ask again, the fox had disappeared into one of those spaces that Joe hadn't even known was there. Joe walked up to where the fox had been standing, but he couldn't see where the tracks had gone. It seemed that the fox had simply disappeared. Joe walked on through the mountains/foothills. Up ahead, Joe could see a forest where he hoped more water and food would be. Joe knew he could arrive by nightfall and kept moving forward. All of a sudden, Joe heard a screech. It seemed so familiar. It sounded like Katie. But Katie had stayed with the pack. Then the sound came again, but it was louder screech. Joe had to check it out. He slowly went back around the bend and could see in the snow a big bear. He was moving loudly and growling, "Grrr." This wasn't good, whoever was on the other side wouldn't survive. Joe heard the screech again and couldn't let this just happen. Joe had a code, and he had to see what was making that noise. Joe took a large circle out around the grizzly bear, over by giant oak trees. This would allow Joe to see what was going on. It was indeed his sister Katie. She was there with a bear on her heels. Katie was frozen and didn't know what to do. Joe immediately sprang into action. Joe barked and ran toward his sister. Joe wouldn't let the same thing happen to their mom and his sister. The grizzly bear heard Joe, and the bear stopped moving forward toward Katie. When Joe got to her side, she said, "Joe, be careful, he's hungry." Joe knew this was going to be a difficult situation. How would they get out of this? He could keep barking, but that may not solve the issue. This bear was 3 times their size, and any fighting might worsen the situation. Then, suddenly, what the fox said came into his head. The fox is always watching for an opportunity to find a different way. Sometimes, it's right in front of you. Joe still didn't know what that meant, but could be an opportunity. To get out of this situation like the fox, Joe had to look and think, because they would be dead if he didn't. How had the fox disappeared? Joe thought about it for a minute. A tree limb was lying to Katie's right with a small hole. Could they go through that hole and hide? Is that what the fox was able to do? Joe decided it was the best choice. If they could be out of sight, then they had a better chance of surviving. Joe said to Katie, "We will go through that hole and run up the hill on that side." Katie said, "What hole?" Joe said, "Just follow me, quickly." Joe squeezed through the tight hole and noticed a row of bushes off to the side with a snow covering. That would be a perfect opportunity to disappear. Katie was squeezing through when the bear started to move forward. The bear was startled that they went through the hole that the bear couldn't fit through. Joe led Katie over to the bushes and they crawled their way into the back. Katie was about to say something, but Joe shook his head. The bear made a loud grrr and then pounced on the tree limb. Nothing seemed to work. After what seemed like an hour, the bear got bored and walked off. Joe said, "Are you okay?" Katie said, "Yes, I came looking for you once I could. I didn't want to be without you." Joe said, "Thank you, you know I will always protect you." Katie said, "Thanks, Joe. "But how did you know to do this, and the bear wouldn't follow?" Joe said, "A wise fox told me that opportunities might be right in front of me. I just have to keep an eye out for them." Joe learned after rescuing his sister that having more opportunities is a good idea. He would need to ponder this. How could he benefit from looking at more choices in his life? He was thinking about them, but there was more to consider. He just escaped a bear. But there would be other bears. This wasn't the first or the last time he would run into one of them. Joe sat down to think. In the past, he had thought he had only 3 options when he encountered a bear: to run, to hide, or to fight. These were the actions the most animals would take. But he now realized that there were more choices. What other ways have I not considered? He thought. How about avoiding bears altogether? If I knew a bear was close, I could simply avoid that area of the forest. Joe was intrigued that he had found another option by simply opening his mind to look for it. It was hard for the young wolf to look at the larger perspective, especially as it didn't come naturally to most animals. Normally they would look at the task in front of them and only that, not understanding how it might fit into the bigger picture. This was a project that Joe decided he would benefit from working on. Joe wanted to get to the forest before nightfall. He led the way and Katie walked beside him until they made it to the forest's edge as the sun was setting. They found an area of deep brush, a little higher up where they could rest. It had been another informative day for Joe, and he could add the lesson of the fox to the lesson he had learned from the mountain goat. The turtle. Armor is heavy, yet it is a proud burden, and a man standeth straight in it. Mark Twain. Joe stayed half awake most of the night. He was keeping a close eye on his sister. He knew that he was supposed to protect her as she was slightly smaller than him. Joe could also smell water. His mother had once told him that there would be a time when he could smell water. He hadn't believed it, but the time was here. It wasn't too far, and they could use some drink. Katie woke up as the sun rose. He looked at her and said, "Good morning. Thanks for coming after me." Katie said, "Joe, that pack wasn't right for me. I have always known you were family. We are here for each other." Joe felt a tear come to his face. He had forgotten how important that family was to him over the last couple of days. Joe said, "I can smell water, let's go get some." Katie smiled. They started walking down the little hill and saw a turtle. The first thing Katie wanted to do was roll it around, but Joe had a better idea. He knew from his experiences as a lone wolf to learn what he could from other animals. He said, "Excuse me, how do you deal with all the people that try to roll you around?" The turtle said, "Just have a suit of armor." Joe said, "What's that?" The turtle replied, "A suit of armor is a level of protection that will always keep you safe from those who intend to harm you. We all have them." Joe replied, "Thanks, but I don't think I have one of those." The turtle replied, "Sure you do." Then, before Joe had time to ask another question, the turtle was walking away. Katie turned to Joe and said, "Huh? I didn't understand any of that." Joe said, "Me neither." They continued through the woods in the direction Joe smelled water. As they approached, they saw several animals drinking from the stream, a deer, birds, and they saw a wolf in the grass. They were nervous about approaching since they had just left a bad situation with the last wolf pack. Neither Katie nor Joe wanted to end up in another mixed-up situation. They were both thirsty, though, and they knew this was the best place to quench that thirst. They approached slowly, on guard the whole way. They noticed the wolf not even looking at them when they got close. It was focused on the deer. Katie was about to tell Joe, but the wolf jumped out and bit the deer's neck. Joe immediately knew the wolf's attention now was on the meal rather than on them. They continued to walk to the watering hole. They were about to emerge from the underbrush when the wolf, who had just killed the deer, appeared in their path. The wolf said, "What are you doing here? This is my territory, and no one is allowed here." Joe replied, "We are just interested in getting some water, then we will move on." The wolf said, "Water? No. If I let anyone who walks by the watering hole over here, then there isn't going to be any left for us." Joe said, "Us? Who else is here?" The wolf replied, "My name is Summer. You know who us is, the rest of the pack. They are out there in the forest and will be back soon." Summer then looked over to the left with her eyes. Joe thought this was extremely strange. Why would she be looking over to the left when the forest was right? Something is going on here that he wasn't entirely clear about. He knew he needed to get his sister some water. It wouldn't hurt to have a meal, but that would be pushing it. Then the turtle came into his mind, and he repeated the words. Without thinking, Joe said aloud, "The suit of armor gives you a level of protection for those who intend to do you harm." He spoke in a hushed tone but loud enough for Summer to hear. Summer replied, "You are here to do me harm." "No, you will not." She was angry and yelled this statement. Joe thought to himself, if we all wear armor suits, maybe this wolf is wearing one for protection. He decided to try a different approach. In a softer tone, Joe said, "My apologies, I am Joe." He motioned to Katie next to him. Joe continued, "We are brother and sister, we wish you no harm. We were kicked out of our pack and are alone in this forest. We saw the water and hope to quench our thirst. If you prefer us to move along, we can." Joe turned to leave. Katie looked mystified since she was really in need of water but wasn't going to argue with her brother at this second. They walked back into the underbrush. When Joe mentioned that he was thrown out of his pack, Summer had a flashback. It was so many years ago that she had intentionally blocked it out of her mind. Summer always hated looking back. She wasn't one to do that. She felt it was always better to be in the present and know the past doesn't define you. Unfortunately for Summer, Joe's words had pushed the memory into her mind and she couldn't help reflecting on it. Summer had been part of a large wolf pack, maybe 50 altogether, working in different small groups to ensure that everyone stayed safe. She had not known any other group, and each morning she would rise and lie in the center of her group next to her parents. They were the guiding light she had always followed. When she was about 3 years old, a bear had come up and grabbed her father. Her father had fought back and the other male wolves had joined him. They were so busy fighting the bear that they didn't see there were 4 more bears that pounced on her mother and her. Summer was pulled deeper into the forest by one of the bears. She thought her family would come and fight to save her, but when they saw that there were 4 more bears, they backed away. Summer was shocked. She had believed the pack would protect her, but she couldn't dwell on this because she had to escape the bear. The bear who had her was smaller than the others, but had her leg gripped tightly. She tried to struggle, but the bear put his paw on her chest, immobilizing her. Summer couldn't see her parents anymore, as the bear dragged her further and further away. How could she escape and get back? Summer looked at the bear closely. She thought it was probably the youngest. Suddenly a branch broke on a tree and the young bear was startled. Summer saw her chance while the bear was distracted. She pulled her leg free and ran as fast as she could. She ran in the direction of the pack, twisting and turning through the woods. It took her a while to find them. Eventually she saw her friends and began to approach them. But an older male came up to her and said, "We are not looking for additional members to our pack. Go and find another pack." Summer said, "What? I was only gone for a little while because of the bear attack." The older wolf replied, "We did run into some bears a little while ago, but the members who were gone were lost in the attack. You must be mistaken." Summer was shocked and upset. They were turning her away. She was about to respond when several wolves lined up beside the older wolf and began to snarl at her. She got the message. She was no longer welcome. Her shock turned to sadness, and her first thought was that it would have been better to die with the bear than to have no pack. But Summer was stubborn. She shook off that thought. She would survive without them, and she could protect herself to make sure this would never happen again. From that day, Summer had never let anyone in. She followed her motto that she was better off alone so that no one could turn her away again. It was her suit of armor. The memory faded as she watched the two wolves walk away. Then they heard Summer say in a monotone voice, "You got kicked out too? Sure, you can have some water." Joe turned around to see Summer walking back to her meal. Katie ran to the water's edge to drink. Joe joined her, and it felt good to quench his thirst. When they finished at the watering hole, they walked over to where Summer was sitting. Katie said, "What happened to you?" "Our mom was killed in a fight, and they didn't want us in the pack anymore." Summer replied through her chewing, "My pack turned their back on me and said I was dead to them." Joe said, "I am sorry. I think exploring and questioning is valuable. I have learned a lot when I ask questions of animals." Summer motioned to the meal and said, "You want some? I am never going to finish all this." Katie, being young, jumped in. Joe said, "Thank you," and joined them. That evening, with their bellies full, they all walked away from the watering hole. Joe was about to say goodbye when Summer said, "There is a nice perch over there that I have found to rest. Would you like to join me?" Joe couldn't refuse. They followed Summer and rested. The Blue Jay. Great things in business are never done by one person. They're done by a team of people. Steve Jobs. Joe was up at dawn. He couldn't believe how well rested he felt. It was the first time in days that he was just content. There was definitely something to be said for being happy with your situation. The aggravation and frustration with the pack were fading. He liked having his sister and this strange wolf Summer with him. Summer woke up and dove into the underbrush. Katie slowly opened her eyes. Joe said, "We should keep moving to see what else is in this forest." They looked around for Summer but couldn't find her. She seemed to have disappeared or run off. Joe thought this was strange, but then Summer appeared. Joe said, "We are going to get going. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us." Summer had a sad look in her eyes, like something was bothering her. Katie whispered to Joe, "Can she come?" Joe said to Summer, "Do you want to join us?" Summer smiled and nodded her head. Joe said, "Come on." He led the way. As he walked, he could hear Summer and Katie talking. Joe had no idea what they were saying, but he occasionally heard a giggle. Joe saw a blue jay up ahead who was calling up in the sky. Then a flock of blue jays appeared. Joe asked, "How did you do that?" to the blue jay. The blue jay replied, "All you have to do is communicate." Joe looked confused, and Summer jumped in to ask the blue jay another question. Summer said, "Do you always communicate like that to call your pack?" The blue jay said, "Pack? I am not sure what that is, but I communicate with my fellow birds. We share when we have found meals, water, when we have a problem, and a solution. By doing this all the time, we all learn and can grow together." Joe replied, "Thank you," but the blue jay had flown off. Summer turned to Joe and said, "That was cool. Communication sounds important." Joe said, "Yes, I think it is, but I am not sure when we would use it." They all shrugged and continued through the forest. Katie said, "I like you both a lot, and I would like to be able to trust you." She paused. Joe and Summer didn't say anything. Joe was wondering if his sister was trying to put her thoughts together. Katie was thinking about her ideas, and she was frightened to share, but she knew if she could tell them her thoughts, it would be better for them to know than keep them bottled inside. Katie continued, "I am scared of being alone and worried about the future. I am still very young but would like to ensure I have a full life. Joe replied, I understand, it's reasonable to be scared. I am a little frightened of the unknown, but I am trying to show strength and keep a positive outlook. I know I am scared of starvation in my heart, but I have this tingle of hope leading me somewhere. Katie's grim expression changed to understanding. Katie knew what Joe meant, and it was the first time she had ever heard her brother admit that he was bothered by anything. She had always seen him as the guiding path, but knowing that he had some concerns reassured her. She needed to hear that she wasn't alone in her journey. Summer had a tear in her eye before she spoke. Summer said, I have been alone for such a long time that I haven't spoken about my fears. It's good to speak about them to you two that care. Summer stopped talking, but Joe knew not to speak yet. This is one lesson he was born with, to know that waiting for someone to finish will allow them to compose themselves. He had seen too many times when others would jump in with their own thoughts too early, and the first wolf would never get to finish their statement. Summer continued, I am scared about being surprised, therefore, I get up each day and run around. I want to make sure there isn't anyone around that will do this to me. It's an instinct, I think, but it's something that I can remember always doing. I am also scared of that loud noise that comes when it rains. I don't know what it's called, but it shakes the ground. I usually hide in a cave or bushes so it can't find me. Summer took a breath, and had a curious look in her eyes. She wasn't sure how this would be taken. She was vulnerable and didn't want that to backfire on her. Joe said, I hate that noise too, it's called thunder. I had it appear one time, and my legs shook so much I couldn't stand. Joe then turned to Summer and walked right up to her face. Katie was curious about what he was doing. Using a calming tone, Joe said, Summer, I like you a lot, and neither Katie nor I would want to surprise you about anything. We are here for you and have your back. If something is going to surprise you, we will handle it together. Then he bowed his head to her. Summer smiled and said in the same tone, Thanks. I appreciate that. The group continued to walk. A little further along the path, a raccoon stuck his head out from under a group of trees. They were not hungry, so they walked by. The raccoon said, I guess you aren't interested in eating me. Could you help me? Joe said, No, we aren't hungry. What's wrong? Summer looked closer and said, There is something around his leg. Joe looked at it. He had no idea what to do. Summer walked around and saw there was a large metal clamp with teeth sticking out every inch around the raccoon's leg. It looked like it had been lying there for years, and hadn't completely closed. It would have penetrated the raccoon's skin if it had worked correctly. Joe had this perplexed look on his face. What did the blue jays say again? Would that help them with this situation? He said it out loud again, You communicate when you have a problem or a solution so you can learn and grow together. Katie jumped in to say, So, if we work together and communicate we can solve this. The three wolves then looked at the thing holding on to the raccoon's leg. Suddenly, Joe had an idea. What if we all pull different parts? He said to his three companions and the raccoon. We will only be able to do this if we work together and communicate. Joe looked at the raccoon. Do you trust us? The raccoon said, Sure. Joe said, We need to know whenever you can move your leg, okay? The raccoon replied, Okay, I can't move it now. Joe walked around the clamp again, trying to decide the next step to get the raccoon's leg out of the clamp. It was made up of two spheres that seemed to close together when the raccoon stepped on the ground between. The raccoon's leg was partly in the clamp. If they could separate the clamp enough, the raccoon should be able to move his leg out of the grip the device had on him. Joe said to Katie and Summer, Let's all get to different sides and see if we can move this thing. Summer got to one side and said, I will push here. She did it by herself, and nothing happened. Joe was about to say something when Katie got to her side and said, What if I push this part? It was a rusty part of the clamp. Katie pushed with her front right leg while Summer and Joe watched. Nothing occurred. Joe said, "We have tried doing this separately. I think we need to do this together. I will count down from 3 and then we all push." This seemed obvious, but it wasn't clear to his friends. This is where the communication the Blue Jay was talking about comes in. They had all made assumptions on how to proceed, but they weren't clear on the solution. This occurs with all of us from time to time. It takes time for us to process and listen to what is being said so we can fully understand. Joe said, "Let me count down so we can coordinate our strength to open the clamp. I am going to use my right front paw to push." "Which paw are you going to use?" Summer said, "I am using my front left paw." Katie replied, "My front right paw." Joe said, "Are we ready?" "Just nod to confirm." All 3 nodded. Joe said, 3, 2, 1, and go." They all pushed the minor parts. The clamp didn't seem to move at all. The raccoon said, "I can move my leg a little." Summer yelled, "Let's push harder. Joe, can you move your side anymore?" Joe tried with all his might. He planted his back to legs and used them to push his front leg. The clamp moved in a different direction. The raccoon said, "I am almost free." Joe said, "Katie, Summer, are you okay with one more push?" The 3 friends were already starting to feel the strain on them. Katie was sweating across her head, and Summer was feeling fatigued. Joe said, "Just a little more." Summer and Katie nodded and they pushed with all they had, and the raccoon was free. Joe said, "Don't just let go yet," to his friends. "Let's time it right, so no one gets hurt." Joe said, "Let's release on 3 again." Then he said, 1, 2, 3. All 3 friends let go. The clamp closed with a bang almost immediately, which made them all jump back. They all looked at each other and laughed. Katie said, "That was fun." The raccoon said, "Thank you," then ran off into the forest. Summer said, "Well, that was fast. I have never seen a raccoon run so fast." Joe smiled and said, he must have had somewhere to be, as he watched the raccoon disappear in the underbrush. Joe thought about this for a minute. He wouldn't have been able to free the raccoon without all of them working together. The only way that was accomplished was with all of them communicating about the same objective, to release the raccoon. Joe thought that if they worked together by speaking this way, they could solve any problem. Everyone in the group talked about the situation and did not focus on other things. He thought this would benefit his friends as they went through the forest. He continued walking, and Joe said, "The nodding that we did when we were pushing was a good communication technique. I didn't realize that we could say something without talking to each other." Summer replied, "In the past, we used this type of method when we wanted to talk among my pack when I was young." Joe replied, "Really? That is very interesting. Are there other things we can say?" Summer said, "Definitely. I thought that we can say bin to each other whenever a bear is near." Katie replied, "I like that. Bin is a cute, quick way of warning us about bears." Joe acknowledged it with a nod of his head. Bin would be their warning to each other. That was intuitive and smart. As a group, you always need to have a language that you can understand, even it's as simple as for survival as they were using. Wolves forget that sometimes it's simple communication that is the most valuable. Katie suddenly yawned, which proceeded to have them all do the same. Joe knew it was time to rest. Joe said, "It's time to rest." There was a complete acknowledgement among all. They found a place that gave them some vantage point to see the surroundings and collapsed from the busy adventure with the raccoon. The beaver. A river cuts through rock not because of its power but because of its persistence. Jim Watkins. The sunshine rose over the forest, and it was so much warmer than it had been in the mountains. Joe's hair was warm, and the radiant light felt like a new day was dawning on the world. Summer sprang up and said, "Good morning." Katie was still sleeping. Summer ran off in the woods. Joe now knew this was her usual ritual, which he could completely understand thanks to the fact that they had shared their feelings and their fears the day before. His day started off surveying everything around him to see if there were threats or exciting things in the forest that he may have missed last evening. Katie got up beside him as he noticed a stream with a waterfall. Katie said, "Let us explore that stream." Joe said, "That's a good idea. Let's just wait for Summer." They continued to look around for a while, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The forest had a nice blowing wind making the branches and leaves sway slightly, but the calm was comforting. Summer was soon back from her scouting trip. Joe said, "We plan to go over to the stream today." Summer smiled in agreement. Sometimes you don't need to say anything to agree with someone. The body language can tell you a lot, showing Joe that Summer was happy with the plan. Summer walked next to Joe since Katie was going to lead the way. She had a plan, and Joe assumed it included taking a swim. When Katie approached the stream, she saw a beaver. Katie said, "Good morning. What are you building?" The beaver responded, "A dam, of course." Katie looked around to see a few beavers working hastily on the structure. Katie replied, "What's the rush?" The beaver said, "Hard work is never hasty. Hard work provides each of us with a purpose to contribute to a bigger goal. Our goal is to build this dam and house. What's yours?" It wasn't a question but more of a statement. The beaver dived under the water and wasn't seen again. His fellow beavers were swimming around, grabbing branches and leaves. Joe was standing next to Katie then said, "Hard work. That sounds important." Katie nodded her head and said, "I am jumping in." A second later, she was swimming around the water. By the time he was going to say something to Summer, she was already in the water swimming. Joe thought he might as well swim too. As they lay around in the water, it was comforting and calm. He was enjoying himself. Joe floated around in the water and thought about his old pack. They were a group of wolves that seemed to roam around from area to area but did not really go anywhere. They knew their lands but just walked and watched. Did they have a purpose? He continued to think about the experiences with his mother, but besides getting water and eating, there was no purpose. As he ventured on this new life with his friends, he didn't want to have a life without accomplishing anything. What could he do that would be different? Joe knew he needed to find out more about this purpose thing. Summer and Katie were playing over by the waterfall. Joe climbed out and walked over by the beaver dam. He sat down and watched them diving under the water, getting out onto the land, and then carrying a stick. It just seemed like they kept moving. But were they like his old pack? He wondered by looking up at the clouds. They seemed to mesmerize him, just slowly moving across the sky. They appeared to be calm and collected. When he brought his head down, Joe jumped up with a startled expression. A beaver had been standing there looking at him. The beaver said, "You seem to be looking for something. I have seen you watching us build for a while." Joe replied, "Yes, you mentioned that hard work leads to a purpose. I just don't understand what that would mean for us." The beaver looked around then sat on a rock on the stream's edge. He said, "I can't tell you what it means for you and your friends, but I can share how I came to find mine." Joe smiled and nodded. The beaver said, "Many years ago, I would float in the streams and rivers to catch food. I was always the happiest when I had food in my stomach. It seemed like that was my goal, was to eat all day. I went home one night to my father, who looked at me and said, 'No dinner for you tonight. It looks like you already ate. Is that all you are going to do with your day?' My dad continued, 'I spent my day helping to find a place for young families to live. It's worthwhile, and I am making a difference in their lives.' The beaver said, my father was a beaver that helped young families get settled in a new place to live. The beaver said, I knew that day when I didn't get dinner, it was my time to venture out into the world. I didn't know what having a purpose meant at the time, but I could see that the hard work my father did gave him joy. My first exploration in what to do was to go to the river that I loved and see if I could catch fish for the family. I would dive underwater, swim, and catch a fish in my mouth, but it never made it to shore. Whenever I tried to catch and hold a fish instead of eating it, the fish was stronger than I. It would always wiggle its way free. I would then try with a smaller fish, but the same occurrence happened. I then would attempt a different tactic to pounce on the fish from the shore and hold on to it. I was young and inexperienced with knowing how to catch fish effectively. No matter what I did, I couldn't keep them long enough. I was beside myself wondering why couldn't I accomplish this simple task. I went back home that night to find my mother sitting there. My mom noticed my face and asked, "What's wrong?" I told her, I tried to catch a fish today for dinner, but when I tried to bring it to shore, I couldn't. My mom replied, "It's okay, son, it takes time and patience. Nothing worthwhile is easy to do." Her words have stuck with me through all those years. I had to find my worthwhile purpose. For the next few weeks, I kept trying different things, from fishing to helping people and moving things around the forest. One day while coming up to a river, I noticed that a beaver was trying to move some mud but didn't know how to get it in its hands. I walked over to him and showed him how you use your tail to scoop up the mud. Then once you have it scooped up, you can swim with it over to the land where you are making the dam. I demonstrated how to do this over and over until the mud starts to have cohesion. This cohesion has the mud stick together. This then allows you to build a mound. It took a day for a small mound. For the following weeks, I would do this repeatedly to show them the method of taking a small mound of mud into a larger hill. The hill would then break the surface of the water. On that day, I would bring the beaver to the side and give them a high five. The beaver said, I told the beaver, "Great job. You did it. You are building the start to a dam. Congratulations." The expression on that beaver's face was amazing. The beaver who was learning was smiling and all excited for themselves. They had done something that was the start of their dam. The beaver shifted on the rock and continued. They were so excited that they were learning how to do this for a dam. It made me all warm inside. I hadn't noticed that it took us a week to build this dam to the surface height. I had been having so much fun. The beaver then said, "A dam is crucial for us as beavers. It gives us access to water and food and keeps our predators away." I continued to work with this beaver day in and day out for weeks. It was fun, and I felt like I was making a difference. After much effort, we successfully built a dam and diverted the water in the stream. I felt confident and realized that I found the thing to give me purpose. To build dams. I have been doing this for years and enjoy each day. I don't even realize I am working when I do it so much. The beaver turned to the wolf and said, "Do you understand? You need to find something that you can do that brings meaning to your days." Joe finally was starting to see what the beaver meant. To do something that would help others was always a part of Joe. He just didn't know how to help. He wasn't made for swimming in the river all day. He replied to the beaver and said, "Thank you. That makes things clearer. I appreciate you taking the time to share your story." The beaver said, "You're welcome," then dove back into the river from the rock. Katie and Summer got out of the water, shook themselves dry, and drank. They were ready to continue exploring the forest. They had been walking around a while but hadn't seen anything but woods. Joe said to his friends, "I had a great discussion with the beaver earlier." Both Summer and Katie looked at him and said almost simultaneously, "When?" Joe replied, "While you were in the waterfall." They understood. Joe continued, "He said we need a purpose or something to do with our time. I remember that in my old pack, all they did was wander. I want to do more than that. Maybe we can help others. Summer said, helping others is good, but who? I am nervous about bringing others near us. Katie acknowledged, we need to be careful, but I understand. I think we could do something. The friends continued through the brush and greenery of the forest. It was good to be out of the blazing hot sun. It was a scorching day. Whenever they were in the open fields, the sun was a weight on their backs. They could hear a ruckus happening up ahead in a hedge of bushes. They slowly approached to see a bear stomping around. They weren't sure what he was doing except crushing around on the ground and breaking branches. Summer said, "What's he doing?" Joe said, "I am not sure, but I don't think we should get closer. We should go the other way." Summer said, "Sure, but we would have to go around." Joe said, "Lead the way." They followed around the area where the bear was doing something when Katie bumped into something that said, "Ouch." Katie said, "I am sorry," assuming it was Joe or Summer since she was daydreaming. The raccoon said, "No worries. Hey. You are the wolves that freed me." Katie said, "Yes, how's the leg?" The raccoon spoke, "Fine. I was wondering, do you guys have a purpose? If not, can you help me?" Joe said, "A purpose? What do you need?" The raccoon spoke, "Well, we could use some safe places to live. That bear keeps breaking down our homes, and we aren't strong enough to get the bigger logs. But you three look like you can assist." Summer replied, "But we usually eat raccoons." Then she wet her lips. The raccoon said, "There are many animals in the forest, if you help them. I am sure they would be okay with you eating a few deer or other animals." Joe said, "We are no lions that can protect you from bears. Bears attack and eat us too." The raccoon spoke, "No, we know you can't provide the protection. We just want sturdier homes." Katie asked before Joe could, "Who are we?" A minute later, a few mountain goats, foxes, turtles, raccoons, and blue jays appeared. The raccoon replied, "We would appreciate the help." Joe thought about this a moment. He said in his head this time, "The beaver said that hard work gives you a purpose. Doing this for them would provide us with a purpose." Joe said, "I am in if Katie and Summer are interested." Katie jumped up and down as little wolves did and said, "Yes. Yes." Summer smiled at Joe and said, "I'm in." 3 months later. Summer said, "Joe, do you need a hand with that log?" Joe replied, "No, I got this." Joe had been lying, his body was hot, and sweat had engulfed him. The temperature had to be in the high 90s, and the sun seemed to follow him no matter where he walked today. He knew that to finish the building, he needed this larger tree limb. Summer hadn't been listening when Joe spoke. She could tell he had taken a limb that was too big for him to carry. Joe was trying to show his friends that he was the alpha male. She knew after these many months when he needed help. Joe was a proud wolf and didn't like to ask for help unless he had no choice. Summer grabbed the other side of the limb. It came off the ground where it had been making deep drag marks along the forest floor. Joe replied, "Hey," out of instinct, thinking someone was messing with him, and he wasn't in the mood today. He turned to see Summer carrying the other side. It was so much lighter with two of them. Joe said thanks and a nod to back up his words. Summer just nodded and walked the limb to the raccoon's new home. This last log would give their home the stability and protection it needed from bears. It would be difficult for the bear to crush the house. They laid the last limb down, and Katie positioned it into place. Katie had become an expert at designing these homes in different styles to help their animal friends. The raccoons came out to look at their new home. They walked around the inside and out, looking at each place. It was so much sturdier than anything they could have built. The limbs they would be able to bring were always light and would easily snap. The raccoon said, "This is amazing, thank you." His family all came running up to Katie, Summer, and Joe. They each were given a hug before they raced inside. They all felt a sense of pride in this accomplishment. Katie said, "This house is exactly what we planned. It reminds me of the fox's house but has lots of places for them to live." Do you remember the smile on the faces of the foxes of surprise and excitement when we built them their home? Joe and Summer nodded. Katie said, "It is the same type of pleasure that the raccoons just shared. I know this is the right thing to do, help others." Joe and Summer just sat down and watched the raccoons go into their new home. There were unspoken words between them. They agreed with Katie, they had found their place in the forest. Afterward. The journey of Joe the wolf and his friends represent all our struggles in life. We are all on a journey through different aspects of these lessons. We are bound by some constraints related to achieving our goals, but anything is possible. By taking the steps forward as Joe did, we can strive and meet our fullest potential. To meet this, we aren't going to go on a straight path. There are many twists and turns that are going to appear along the way, but it's how we can overcome and push through these uncertain times that define us. We all have that wolf inside us, it's just how we take that initiative is how we are remembered. This is the first book in a series to meet our life and career goals. Overcoming adversity, pushing through challenging times, and how we treat others throughout our life. Define us as wolves. Summary. The Wolf's Path demonstrates the life skills we all need every day of our life. Following the lessons that Joe the Wolf has learned, everyone can meet any goal. The mountain goat taught Joe to think outside the box. We all can't achieve any of our aspirations without trying to solve the problem. We need to adjust our vantage point at the situation to think differently, which leads us to success. The fox taught Joe to always be on the lookout for opportunities. Opportunities exist for us all the time, but we sometimes aren't looking for or searching for them at that point. We need to remember that in our everyday lives, we just need to keep our eyes, ears, and attention always open to new journeys since you never know where they will lead. The turtle taught Joe about the suit of armor that we portray to the world. We all show the world one thing based on our experiences by knowing what we show others. Improving what we show to people will enhance our interactions with everyone. If we can be honest and truthful in our interactions, people will be more receptive to our ideas. The blue jay taught Joe about clear and concise communication. It is so vital for team success. We forget that communication is something that we do each day, but we could be misunderstood when we go into detail. The beaver taught Joe that we all need a purpose in life. When we have a purpose to fulfill, we all feel like we can make a difference. By learning this lesson, we can look at our strengths to achieve. The end.